And I think at the end of the day, if your mission is sustainability, if your mission is equitable access, if your mission is education for the next generation, well, we hit all of those topics.
Welcome to Workmorphis Wired, where we dive deep into the future of work and explore the transformative impact of AI and other emerging tech through conversations with thought leaders, policy experts, and industry innovators. Please note that the content of this episode, which features a discussion on blockchain technology, is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Our guest today is Andrew Burchwell, who is a geoscientist, entrepreneur, and blockchain strategist. Andrew is passionate about optimizing energy utility and developing infrastructure for the 21st century digital economy. He began his career in geoscience, working on carbon capture and sequestration technologies at Battelle, which is a Columbus, Ohio-based applied science and technology research nonprofit. In 2022, Andrew founded the Ohio Blockchain Council, which is dedicated to making Ohio the premier jurisdiction for blockchain and Bitcoin technologies. His work involves cross-sector collaboration with university researchers, industry professionals, and government leaders. Andrew's mission is to position Ohio as a leader in blockchain innovation. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So let's start from kind of the beginning, from your background in geoscience. What drew you into the blockchain industry?
Yeah, I get that question a lot because it's not intuitive how somebody goes from studying the earth to working in digital assets and blockchain. And I can tell you that my journey from the philosophical perspective really started with asking questions like, what is money? And how that relates to the early technology, which, Bitcoin was the first inception of a blockchain technology that we would use in common parlance. Being an energy researcher, I started to notice how systems develop at scale. And I started to work in that public-private partnership domain where we would take novel ideas and we would try to make sense of them. And then we would make them easier for industry to move forward. And in 2021, I realized that there was a direct intersection with Bitcoin, with digital assets, through something that we call cryptocurrency mining. And as soon as I put the two ideas together, which was I thought there was this very novel and innovative thing happening in the digital assets and blockchain technology space, but that it tied directly to energy systems and how we can build better energy systems in the process of using these tools. And I noticed that not many people were talking about that, and I just found it supremely interesting. And so really my geoscience background led me to working in energy, which led me to thinking about money and systems in a new way. And for the last 3 years, I've been working to develop Bitcoin mining here nationally. And then, of course, as soon as you're doing something new, it takes a little bit of organization to really make that work. And so from our perspective, we noticed that other states were doing really well in organizing a novel industry and trying to be champions of something that was nascent and still yet to be fully developed. And as a native Ohioan and somebody that lives here and loves the state, I really felt like Ohio had a part to play in that. And we really felt like we had to help. And so in 2022, we started the Blockchain Council as a way to organize member companies to basically utilize common resources towards a common goal, which, as you stated in your wonderful introduction, thank you for that. We wanted to make Ohio a premier jurisdiction for these technologies. And I think we've had some success there, and I'm really proud of that work. I think we have a long way to go. But I think the moment's right for this, and I think Ohio is one of the states that can lead this charge, both nationally and globally.
Love that mission. It's really cool what you're doing and helping Ohio stay on the cutting edge with technology, which it's really continued to refine its reputation for. So that's very exciting. And I want to come back to your vision for the Ohio Blockchain Council and how you're thinking about the future. But before we do that, I've heard you talk about your grandma test before, which I love, I think is really interesting. And for our listeners, the grandma test is essentially Andrew saying if he can't explain what he's doing to his grandma, then maybe he hasn't simplified it enough. So in accordance with your grandma test, Andrew, could you explain to our listeners what blockchain is and why it matters to them?
Thank you for that. I often wonder if that's the right approach, and I haven't really asked my grandma what she thinks about that idea. From my perspective, a blockchain is just a fancy type of database. And we've been using databases for a long time. And I think that it runs in the background so well that we often don't realize that much of what we do from a technology perspective is built on these things, unless you work in Excel. And then you understand how complicated and tricky even just managing a simple database can be. And so when we talk about blockchain technologies, what we're really saying is that there's a new type of database that allows us to build something that is different than a traditional database that has certain benefits and, of course, certain drawbacks too, which we can talk about. The simple benefit is that a blockchain ledger, and we can use Bitcoin as the pure example of this, allows for us to record information in a way that it can't be changed easily, which allows us to verify information over time in ways that can build trust. And so the blockchain is almost the simplest aspect of what these technologies are. And it's important to recognize that a technology like Bitcoin is not just a blockchain. It incorporates many different aspects of different types of technologies. But the blockchain is the ledger, it's the database that allows us to store the information. And if you think about it, really all we're saying is that there's a chain of information that's stored in blocks or chunks of information. And so a blockchain is simply just a series of chunks of information that, in the case of Bitcoin, for instance, get recorded to that ledger every 10 minutes.
That comparison to a database makes it really approachable, especially I think for people who have had experience with Excel. What makes blockchain technology so different?
That phrase, blockchain technology, can mean a lot of different things. So, in the instance of Bitcoin as a blockchain technology, what's different about it is that it allows us to be sure that the information that's recorded is true and unchanged. If you go into an Excel database, you can recognize that values can be changed easily. And this is, for instance, how people commit accounting fraud. If it's easy for you to change, then anybody can change it at any time. And if I want to be sure that that information that was recorded 10 years ago is still the same information, which we can recognize in the age of AI, is an increasing concern. How do we know that something is real? How do we know that that information we're receiving is true? I think that's the novel shift. And there's ways in which we use that blockchain technology with other aspects of technology to ensure that that information is unchanged, that that information stays hardened against any type of corruption of that information.
So, you talked a little bit about your vision right now and the work that you've done through the Ohio Blockchain Council. What do you hope to achieve over the next 5 years?
My hope is that in the next 5 years, Ohio continues its legacy of innovation and really becomes a state that champions these technologies to ensure that the state flourishes. I think that we're in a moment where people are starting to recognize that these things that they may not understand are sticking around. Every once in a while, people get this idea that maybe these are passing fads and this comes and goes. I think we're in a moment now, and especially with the institutional adoption we're seeing with the ETFs that have been approved, that it's no longer just people sitting in the shadows that are interested in this niche technology. Wall Street is involved. The highest levels of government are now thinking about these tools. I think it's really important that we start thinking about how the world operates and how we govern this world and how we can better empower people at lower levels of governance and coherence. And we're in this sort of shift from a fully centralized model of nation state authority to something that I think is more empowering to the people at more local levels. We're able, through the internet and other types of technologies, to really cohere groups of people and organizations and resources in ways that we've never been able to do. And from my perspective, these tools are just a means to do that well within a state that we care about, a state that we live. And so our mission is just aligned with that. The Ohio Blockchain Council is just a means for us to tell that story and really organize these ideas and really tell that story to people who will listen. And very thankful that people are listening now. And I imagine over the next 5 years, it will become even more obvious that there's a lot for us to talk about here.
Absolutely. So much there that I want to go into more depth on. On the Ohio part of things, Ohio is well positioned because of its economy and also because of the legacy infrastructure that the state has as an industrial manufacturing hub. One example of that would be Standard Power's Coshocton Blockchain and Data Center. So I want to go deeper into the Ohio aspect of this, but before we talk about the economy, let's talk about the people. Blockchain is one of those technologies like artificial intelligence that is very abstract, kind of conceptual. It's not something that you can quite get your hands on. And so for that reason, it can feel inaccessible to a lot of people. I think we're seeing that evolve just like we did with AI, with generative AI. Now, most people, if you have access to a device, can interact with it. So hopefully we'll see blockchain kind of trending in that direction where more people are more comfortable with it. Why should the average Ohioan care about blockchain or cryptocurrencies from your perspective?
I think there's a lot of ways we can think about this through time. And I understand today, as we sit here, most people might look at it and say, what could this do for me? And may just look at it as a speculative investment. And we hear a lot of that where, well, I'm just investing in cryptocurrency in case the number goes up. And I certainly understand that perspective. And I think we don't do a great job of really speaking to the broader benefits that these tools can provide. But I always tell people, when we think about the unbanked and a global population of people who don't have access to traditional banking, we often look to the third world countries and say, well, here's a population of people we can help by giving them access to the internet, a smartphone, and some measure of ability for them to bank themselves in some way. But I always tell people, as much as we can help Africa with these types of endeavors, what about Appalachia? What about rural Ohio? We really forget that there's a tremendous amount of people in this country and in our regions that still also don't have access to these traditional services. These tools allow them to gain access to and control over and the ability to spend any resources they have available to them today. And I think that's a really good place to start.
That was a really thoughtful and interesting example of how people in many different scenarios, many different environments can benefit from this type of technology. Personally, I find it fascinating. You talked about people who don't have bank accounts, people who are unbanked. And some of that sometimes can come down to trust. And, who do we trust our money in the hands of, whether it's other people or companies and things like that. And what's so interesting to me personally about blockchain and cryptocurrencies is that it really is kind of removing that trust factor altogether because of the way the technology works. But it's still so new to a lot of people, and the trust of the technology isn't quite there. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. How can we do a better job of helping people trust in the technology?
We really have to tell better stories about the ways in which these tools are sufficiently trustable. I often also think that, when it comes down to technologies that we don't necessarily understand, having an interface to these technologies that I can rely on, that I understand, is supremely important. And so for me, I think the trust battle is won over time through better applications, better user interfaces. And I talk about this a lot with people because I don't know how my email works. I don't understand TCP/IP, which is the backbone of everything we do on the internet. I'm never going to. I'm not interested in that. And I also don't think that most people are going to be interested in really understanding how the blockchain works and how proof of work keeps it secure. I think what they're going to want is an app that they like and that they can use that's reliable, and that when they try to accomplish a function, it works. And I do think we're fairly early in that. And so there aren't great examples of that. But you can look at examples like Venmo and Cash App as analogies for how we can move this forward very quickly just by incorporating these new types of assets, because people already trust Cash App. I send money through that every day, and I'm not worried that my money is going to get lost in the middle somewhere. And I think at the end of the day, when we have those tools and when those tools are sufficiently scaled, people are going to worry less about, is this trustworthy? And also at the same time, I do think that there's a recognition process that occurs with any new technology that when something's new, it sounds scary, and maybe I don't want to touch it, and maybe I'm just going to wait and see. And so the more that we have legitimate institutional level companies to interact with, if I buy Bitcoin and I have a company that I can call their customer service and say, hey, I'm having trouble with this aspect of sending or receiving, and somebody, a real person, is on the other end of the line and can answer your question for you, that really goes a long way with people. Because at the end of the day, I don't imagine that my grandma, for instance, is ever going to know how blockchain interacts with the world. But if she can use an app on her phone, that's easy and she doesn't have to. And I do think broad adoption looks like these tools running in the background and most people not even really realizing that that's at work, that this is a blockchain technology. They'll call it something else. And I think that's okay too.
Great connection between user experience and trust. That's what it comes down to, whether it's a new technology or a government service. I mean, that's been our experience as well, is that's a great way to build trust at scale. So very interesting insights. We've talked a lot about financial services. Can you give maybe 2 or 3 simple examples of how blockchain can be used in different industries outside of finance?
Sure. I think one of the most interesting things to me right now, it relates to how we verify information, and that could be personal records. And so a lot of people are really interested in how we can use the blockchain or different types of tools in our industry to better manage public health records, better manage identification and verification and credentialing. And so I think of those examples, it's really important to think about how the traditional system works, which either you're sending all of your personal information to the government or to a third party centralized entity. And then you're essentially trusting that entity, whether it's government or the third party, to keep all of that information safe, to not get hacked, to maintain the integrity of that information. And we see it all the time. That doesn't work. I mean, even the government can get hacked, and all of our information can be our social security numbers, every piece of information you might need to sign up for a credit card or something of that nature is just out there in the world. And we trust these systems to keep it safe, and they really can't. And so I think that that's where these tools, these blockchain technologies, will become very interesting, is especially in a world of lack of trust, and especially in a world of artificial intelligence generating ways through some of these mechanisms of security. It's going to be really important for us to have a secure ledger. It's going to be really important for us to be able to then verify the information that's on the ledger without also putting that information at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I was laughing earlier because this just resonates, and it seems like a pain point that probably a lot of people have. As somebody who personally recently had my data breached through a service that I got rid of a couple years ago, I've been through that, and in my household, we talk about it a lot. My husband is in the medical profession, and he works across different state lines virtually, so he has to get credentialed in multiple different states. Well, in that case, you are requesting a physical copy of your diploma from the Ohio State University or whichever university every single time, and faxing it or mailing it, and risking that information getting stolen or lost along the way. And so it's something we talk about a lot in our household, but there just seem to be a lot of quality of life improvements that could come along with the technology. So before we dive into the workforce implications of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, I wanted to talk to you about something I recently read about in the news. And I know just enough to be dangerous, so please do correct me, make sure that we're getting this information right for our listeners. But I wanted to acknowledge the recent approval of Ether and Spot Bitcoin ETFs. From my understanding, this means that people can now invest in these cryptocurrencies through regular stock market like funds, making it easier and safer since they don't actually have to manage the crypto directly. So, this makes crypto theoretically more accessible, which might boost consumer confidence and attract more investors. So, given those trends, from your perspective, what's one big thing Ohio could do today to become a national leader in blockchain and cryptocurrency innovation?
Yeah, very simply, state pension funds can invest in these tools through the ETFs now immediately. And we saw this recently with the state of Wisconsin essentially announcing that though it was a small percentage of their pension fund, I think it was 1/10 of 1%, $180 million were invested into the Bitcoin ETFs over the last quarter. And so from our perspective, that's something every state should be doing. And we do currently have legislation that's been introduced in the state of Ohio that would require the pension funds to take a look at this and provide a report on the potential for this, because now it's no longer that we have to, as you said, custody these technologies, these digital assets ourselves, which I fully understand. There's a process at work there. There's some leeriness about applicability when you're using essentially public funds to do that. But now Fidelity can do that for us. Now BlackRock is offering a product to do that for us. And I think in that way, it's no longer a mystery technology. It's no longer something that people are going to be unsure about. Now people are going to be curious about it. And I do think, again, going back to Bitcoin being the best performing asset of the last decade, in an era of inflation that we certainly can see is getting a little interesting, if we're looking to take the funds that are essentially managed by state government agencies to maintain and flourish the wealth of the groups of people it intends to serve, it's almost foolish not to be invested in these tools. And again, I'm not saying put the whole portfolio into it. 0.1% is a great place to start. And then you just watch it. And then in 4 years from now, it will be, from my perspective, so obvious that that was the right decision that you'll be like everybody else who works in this industry or who's been paying attention to this for enough time. You're going to think we didn't invest enough in these early on. And I think that's just going to be the moment over and over again. So part of the mission that I'm here to effect is to really educate people on that topic and really get them to see that now is the time. And it is no longer a gamble or a game of random chance. These are legitimate institutional products being offered by the most serious Wall Street firms in the country. And again, I think we would be foolish not to do that.
What would be the benefit to a state like Ohio in this case of being an early adopter?
Well, we would show that we're a leader. I think Ohio has historically always been a leader in innovation, and I do try to remind people of that. And you mentioned the legacy of manufacturing and the history and heritage of that, the birthplace of flight, for instance. And I think there are so many examples of that. And I think because we are a leader in the global economy, we should be a leader in this economy too. And so I think it's really important when you believe in something to stand out in front of it and really speak to its benefit. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. But at the end of the day, I'm doing that so that others have the courage to do that. And so that our state, as a group of people, but as a governmental apparatus, can also stand out in front of it. Let's not forget that in 2017, 2018, Ohio was the first state to allow tax payments with cryptocurrency. And I think that's not to be forgotten or lost in all of this. I think it really speaks to the courage that we do have to be able to take on new things. And so we won't necessarily be the first to do some of these things, but we can be at the top. We can be a leader in this because it is still very early. And I think in that way, Ohio is an opportunity here. And I think every politician, for instance, on any side of any issue that wants to show that they're thinking about the next generation of people has to take on this issue positively. And I think we're starting to see that, but I think there's a lot more we can do there as well.
Absolutely. Having served in the public sector before myself, there's this overwhelming desire to be a steward of public trust and make sure that the state or whichever government is doing things with the best interest of citizens in mind. If you were talking to a group of state pension system directors and they were skeptical about this, what would you say to them, or what resources would you point them to help them feel more confident in this consideration?
I think at the end of the day, it's really important to understand the basics of the technology. And I see this a lot in the conversations I have where people, and I say this all the time, they'll literally throw their hands in the air and say, I just don't understand what this is. And I think that's a defensive wall against really trying to dig in. And so in that way, there's all kinds of great resources that are available. The Columbus headquartered company, River, they have a great educational arm online available for free, where you can go and just look at the basics of the terminology and say, here's what this means, here's what that does, here's how this works to your benefit. I think at the end of the day, people really respond to data. And so there are all kinds of research reports being released by, the big four traditional auditing firms. Deloitte is very heavy into this industry. KPMG is as well. and don't want to disclude others, but I don't want to just start naming all of them. But the truth is that all of these institutions are thinking about this, and they're releasing reports on the topic. And so I think there's enough factually driven information out there from these institutions that you just have to choose to want to read it. And so from my perspective, it's become educated at a very basic level about what the terminology means. Don't be afraid of the topic because it seems novel or mysterious. And then I think you just look to the other examples of states that are doing this well and look into the reasoning behind these things. The state of Wisconsin didn't do this on a whim. They've had people thinking about this for some time. And I would encourage them to just go talk to those people. Try to understand what it is that they saw, because we see this all the time. As soon as you really dig into this topic and as soon as you really understand the nature of these technologies and what they're really capable of accomplishing, it's actually astonishing. I consider myself one of the luckiest people in the world to get to do this, because these tools are revolutionary. There's something unlike anything we have ever seen before. And in that way, we owe it to ourselves to want to understand. And that doesn't mean, again, that you're going to be an expert in how these tools actually work in the process of the blockchain being developed or in proof of work, securing the network. But just understanding how they work should get people excited enough to want to take it on. And then at the end of the day, it's a risk measure. And so we have to be sure that as good stewards of people's money, that we're making a risk adjusted type of decision. And so again, I would simply point them back to the institutions. And there are, I believe, 14 of them right now that are offering institutional ETF products, and simply have a conversation with them, because they wouldn't be doing it if they thought these assets were risky in the same way.
You mentioned how you feel very fortunate to be in this position and excited to be working around these technologies all the time. I think we are both in a fortunate position, and many of our listeners, as people who are decision makers who have an audience, are in a fortunate position to be able to share that information. And I do personally believe that we have a duty when we have access to this information to make it available. And I know that's something that you and the Ohio Blockchain Council are working on, and really appreciate that. So we talk a lot on this podcast about AI and the importance of literacy in building trust and in effective implementation and in mitigating risk. And so that, in my mind, applies to blockchain as well. So what we'll do is we'll be sure to link to River's resources in the notes. And if there are any others, please do send those to us so that we can make sure any of our listeners who want to educate themselves or people in their circles, their constituents, can have access to those resources. Andrew, you are a self-described maximalist when it comes to blockchain. You've said before that you believe that blockchain technology and Bitcoin specifically is going to integrate into every single sector of the economy somehow at some point, and that the work of the Blockchain Council is part of seeding the ecosystem for the technology. I'd like to talk about workforce development. How can these technologies be applied in a workforce development context?
Like any new tool, you're going to need people that understand it in order to build it. And I think what we're noticing already is that companies are looking to develop in this ecosystem. And it's important to understand that these tools are coded just like many other types of software are coded. And we simply need more people who understand the language it's being coded in order to develop the next generation of application. And so in that way, I think that there's a real need right now for universities specifically to be taking this topic on, because they know that students are interested in this topic, and they know that they can't actually to date meet the need of that growing demand. And so when we talk about a growing sector of decentralized finance, it's going to require many thousands of people. I think there are estimates that it's something like 5 million jobs over the next 6 years by 2030. And so in that way, we're simply unprepared for the growth of what's coming. And in that way, we need to be training people, not just in the software applications of this, but in the hardware applications of how the computational systems perform. We're seeing, as you mentioned before, on the data center side of this, because these can be, and especially in the case of Bitcoin, very intensive processes. So you need people who can wire the facilities. You need people who can manage the computers themselves. And you need people who are operationally sufficient to ensure that those systems are running and running well at all times. And then you get into the energy component of this equation, and it gets very interesting very quickly, because from my perspective, these systems, as we scale them, are the greatest complement to developing better energy systems, period. And we can see that at small scales, and we can see it in places like Africa, even, where the natural market mechanism of Bitcoin mining and the reward of Bitcoin and doing the work is allowing villages in Africa to bootstrap microgrids to provide electricity to people that have never had it before. And in the same way, we're going to see, and especially in an era of what is essentially going to be an energy crisis. I mean, I don't mean to be alarmist, but I don't think most people realize how dangerous it's getting within our energy grid systems very quickly, not just in terms of the growth of power demand that's coming from traditional data centers like the ones that a Microsoft or an Amazon or a Google or a Meta would build, but we're also shuttering the generation of the last 50 to 100 years in a way that's creating a supply-demand imbalance that will essentially lead to brownouts or blackouts if we're not careful. And so from our perspective, we're really trying to get people to understand that the jobs that are required to build better systems and to make these technologies work and to really be a complement to the security of our energy future is an all of the above approach. And we're going to need as much new energy solution as possible. So if you're somebody that's really interested in solar farms, well, Bitcoin mining is a great complement to that for many reasons that aren't necessarily worth digging into here. But you could just imagine, for instance, in West Texas, where there's a lot of sun and we would build large solar farms, there aren't necessarily a lot of people. So then you have to build infrastructure to get that power to people. And that takes time, that takes money. And in the meantime, in order to ensure that the financing of a project makes sense, you need to be really selling that power to somebody. And lo and behold, Bitcoin mining is so location agnostic that it can go anywhere and it can consume any type of power. And it can be flexible enough to meet the intermittent requirements of a system like solar or wind. The case is also true of nuclear, natural gas. It really is an all of the above approach. And all of those systems, as we build them and as we grow, because we know that the usage of energy is essentially one-to-one correlated with quality of life. There's no scenario in which we're using less energy and it leads to a better outcome for people. So we're going to have to use energy. That's just the way of the world. But there's a way for us to use that energy more efficiently. There's a way for us to waste less in the process. Most people don't realize that 80% of all power that's generated is essentially not utilized because of losses in the system and because of inadequacies in the supply and demand imbalances. So if we can shore that up through a flexible tool that also provides a financial mechanism for the world to uplift itself, that to me is a miracle. And we should be doing that as much as possible. And so I really hope to tell that story, but at the end of the day, we really have to prepare the workforce of the next century to meet that demand. And it is going to take a new way of thinking. It is going to take more clever approaches to training people. So it isn't just that you're going to need a PhD or a 4-year degree. We need technicians. We need entry-level jobs. We need a really all of the above approach to all of this. But I think if people really see it clearly, this is a tremendous opportunity for us to do that.
It's a similar kind of conversation like the one that we've had in the workforce space about emerging energy tech jobs in general, as well as broadband expansion or just utility jobs, things like that. As a membership-based organization, you represent the needs of companies. What are some of the highest demand jobs that your companies are hiring for or anticipate needing to hire for in the near future?
Yeah, I think data center technicians is a large one right now. And I think especially as we look to where these facilities are typically built, because again, going back to the underutilized infrastructure of the old economy, well, traditionally that's not in city center. That's in the rural parts of the state. That's in areas where not only did those manufacturing facilities or whatever it might have been, not only did that leave, but then when there was no economy locally, the people also left. And so we're in this situation where we try to revitalize those areas. There aren't necessarily the people that have the skills to do that type of job. And so we have to train those people. And so, a data center technician, a network engineer, things of that nature are supremely important. But otherwise, it really does go back to the coding and the software development, because at the end of the day, the tools that are Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these other things are base layers, essentially. Layer one technologies. And so layer two, layer three looks like a stack of applications and integration. And people may have heard of this Web3 concept, but really all that's saying is we use the base layer of the tool to build the applications and the integration for people to be able to interconnect and utilize these tools. And so we need people to build those too. And so I think software and coding mixed with a little bit of the hardware and network engineering is the highest demand we see right now. But I imagine, as all things do, that will also evolve. And so we have a really hard problem where we have to meet the demand of today, but we have to also anticipate the needs of tomorrow. And I'm sure that can be a very hard challenge. So really, more than anything, we need to be teaching people to be resilient and flexible and to utilize foundational skills like critical thinking to be able to adapt, because I can't tell you what things are going to look like in 10 years, but I know that there will be jobs that need done. And so we have to build a resilient population of people that are able to, move with the winds, so to speak.
Certainly. And we have this conversation, a similar conversation in any emerging industry or emerging area of technology, because those foundational skills are so essential, and the desire and the capacity to continue learning and continue learning new skills that build upon those foundational ones. And that might transfer from one industry to the next. So it sounds like these are high paying jobs in a variety of different educational pathways, meaning that you might find a job because you have a specialized PhD, you might find a job because you have a specialized technician certification. So in our conversations about workforce development like this, we talk a lot about the assets in the marketplace, meaning the universities, as you mentioned, the community colleges, the technical schools that build up the talent pipeline that we need for the future. I'll ask this question in kind of two different ways. Are there any great examples of institutions like that you're aware of who are training people for these jobs? And alternatively, if you'd like to answer this question instead, what can those institutions be thinking about and doing to make sure that they're ready to produce that workforce for the future?
Yeah, I think it's still pretty early for the traditional university systems to have something that looks like a robust program. I think that we see this more at the level of the technical college. Western Governors University, for instance, as an example of an institutional level educational apparatus that wants to take these things on. And we're working in partnership with them to try to figure out how to train people through their programs. The individual companies are, for better or worse, the ones that are doing the best at this right now, because they have the immediate demand and they have the resources to be able to do this, because again, they know that there's a job waiting for people on the other side of that. And so companies like Foundry Digital Services, based out of Rochester, New York, does a great job of really trying to take, let's say, some of the underserved parts of the community and really give them a pipeline and access to a lift, to a hand up, so to speak. And so apprenticeship programs are really the model as we see them right now. And I think in that way, we're going to have to start developing these things within more traditionally recognized institutions so that people see that this is a pathway. At the end of the day, if I'm not aware that this exists, how could I possibly choose it as a career path? So even earlier than that, I think there needs to be a lot of work for us to really start going into the middle schools and high schools and really educating the younger generation about these ideas and sparking curiosity and maybe a little bit of ambition for them to take this on. And as we know, just like coding, there's no age requirement to be good at it. 12-year-olds can code programs with the best of them. And I think in that way, these tools are going to be the same way. And really seeding that intention is going to help us 10 years from now, where we're not really going to have time to try to convince people of these ideas. We're just going to have to be building, and we're just going to have to be working on these tools. And so I think in that way, it really is about a generational shift in mindset. So I think there's a lot we can do there. But again, we're still so very early in this. It's really hard to look at great examples today on the ground. But I think that's, again, our duty. That's our work to do.
You're no stranger to public-private partnership. It's part of your background and what you do in the Ohio Blockchain Council. There are some interesting roadmaps that have been created with industry, education, and government coming together to solve problems like this. Is Ohio Blockchain Council involved with any of those? Or alternatively, would you and your members be open to sitting down with education leaders, government leaders to try to solve this problem together?
We are actively working on it. And of course, I'm very open to that because that to me was the mission from the onset of this. I think, again, a lot of that comes down to education about why and how much, right? People want to understand, okay, if we put resources towards something, what will it lead to? We're in active discussions right now with, Ohio State University about developing an innovation lab around these concepts. The University of Cincinnati already has a crypto economics lab where they're trying to develop the next generation of talent. And so we work in partnership with them to really flesh that out and create a flourishing environment for that so that it's not just a handful of people, but that it can be a very robust process. When it comes to the state and then the federal levels of government, I think we have a real great opportunity. But unfortunately, I think that these tools are such that, there's a little bit of hesitation as we sit here today about wanting to take these topics on. And there are various reasons for that. But the opportunity is there. And I think it's really about finding the angle that resonates and really finding, as I've learned through my career, champions internally that really want this to happen. And I think as soon as that does, it's very straightforward because the resources are available. But we're very lucky at a state perspective to have a very robust budget. And I think federally, there's a lot of money being spent right now to really encourage the next generation of IT, of energy infrastructure. And sitting at the intersection of that, my perspective was always that, well, if I can see it, other people can see it too. And it really is just a matter of finding the right conversations, finding the champions internally, and then really creating something that looks legitimate enough from the eyes of, a stakeholder that has a lot of reporting requirements. And of course, we don't want to be an industry that just tries to take advantage of public funds because they're available. I think we want to utilize those to the best of our ability. And so I think that's a work in progress. Of course, if anybody's listening that has an interest in that or an ear to it, I would love to talk to you. I think at the end of the day, that is the mission, because this is perhaps the largest public-private opportunity that we could see and endeavor to create within the ability for us to use digital assets as a tool for upliftment for people. And I think at the end of the day, if your mission is sustainability, if your mission is equitable access, if your mission is education for the next generation, well, we hit all of those topics. And I think, it really just takes that moment of, instead of throwing your hands in the air and saying, I don't understand this, being willing to have a conversation and listen. And so doing my best, I think that there's a lot for us to do there, but I certainly think that that's the mission. And I think over the next 5 years, we'll really see that come to fruition.
What a great way to conclude our conversation with an invitation for leaders in the community, people in the community, to bring themselves to the table, to be at the table with you to help design solutions for the future. I love that. So as conversation comes to a close, Andrew, any big upcoming announcements or things that we should keep an eye out for from Ohio Blockchain Council?
We intend to host our yearly summit. We call it Amplify. It's a way to bring people to Columbus and show them how great this city is, but also talk about these topics with industry leaders. That will be on September 19th of this year in downtown Columbus, and I would love to see everybody there.
Excellent. We will link to that information and River and some of the other resources that we talked about today. Andrew, this has been a really enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise and really making these topics approachable so that leaders who are listening can think about what it means for the future. Really appreciate your time today.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Workmorphis Wired. If you enjoyed the conversation, please let us know by leaving a rating and review. To make sure you don't miss any future episodes, be sure to subscribe. Finally, if you found value in today's discussion, we hope you'll pass the podcast along to a friend or colleague. As always, thanks for tuning out the noise and tuning in to Workmorphis Wired.